Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We have a very traditional Munich summer day for us today. So I'm just here to say welcome. My name is Caitlin Corrigan. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and AI. If you need anything while you're here, you can talk to me, or we have a lot of our staff around to give you any help. Obviously, you've all welcomed yourself to tea and coffee. We also, in the breaks, welcome you to, go down and get some fresh air, but make sure you kind of find a IEA staff so we can get you back up. I thank you all for traveling. A lot of you traveling very far, near and far. I think we have a really interesting group here. We were like overwhelmed. At first, we thought this would be like a little 20-person workshop, and we were just overwhelmed with the amount of people who wrote us saying they were interested in coming, and then trying to pick through all those interesting people to make sure we could all fit in one room and have a really productive day. Every one of you was here because, we thought you could really contribute to the conversation. And today is really about, you've all seen the homework you got, the draft that our lovely team and Alex has put together for us to kind of rip apart today. And dissect and really get into deep discussions on this important topic. So with that, I also want to hand over to our partners from Globethics, Wallace, to give you a few welcome words as well.
Thank you, Kathleen. So firstly, I would like to appreciate IEAI and the TUM team for organizing this and put it together a wonderful program. I also thank you all for participating to come to Munich, not for EuroCup, but for AI. For those who do not familiar with Globethics, Globethics is a Swiss foundation based in Geneva, have global presence. Its aim is to improve ethical leadership through education, policy dialogue, and public engagement. AI and ethics is one of the areas under one of our priorities. We work on 3 tracks: AI, human rights, AI in education, and AI intergenerational dialogue on AI. Yeah. By the way, I will put another advertisement of our Globethics Forum in September, 2nd to 4th of September in Geneva. One of the track is on trustworthy AI for inclusive future. I welcome you guys to participate online or in person. Yeah, I would like to partly to start or to end by starting asking you a question. What do you think is the greatest invention of humankind? Anyone would like to try? 3 tries. AI? No, sorry. Wheels. Okay. A solar power? Penicillin. Okay. Yeah. Writing, printing. Okay. Sorry? Airlines. Airplanes. Okay. Wonderful. Oh, good guess. Yes. Electricity. Go ahead. Technology. What kind of computers? Great. Yeah. I think all these are remarkable inventions, right? The greatest invention is human rights. This is I learned from one of UNESCO conferences early this year. One of the speakers is a digital transformation minister of Slovenia. He said, gunpowders, computers, electricity are all great inventions, but the greatest one is human rights, which I agree. That's why we come here, right? So we look forward to a very stimulating discussion on this topic. Just personally, what I want to learn from this conversation are 3, among other things, are 3 key things. First is how to operationalize existing human rights principles, right? We can refer to the second version of Global Digital Compact. The main focus there actually is about that, okay? How to ensure the human rights are respected, promoted, and protected in a digital space, right? So I think it's very important how to operationalize this existing agreed universal principles of the human rights. The second thing is more proactive is, can we also foresee or anticipate some new human rights space or challenges, opportunities in the age of AI? This morning I was thinking, do we have a right to be disconnected, right? In AI age, indigenous people population, they have harmonized living styles. They want to preserve their culture. Do they have rights to be disconnected into this crazy digital world? I'm just thinking out loud. But it's an open question. What are the new human rights issues in the age of AI? And finally is, because I'm a trained economist, always want to bring the political economy aspect to this debate. The market economy is always talk about efficiency, right? But we want to have a balance of efficiency, of equity, right? With more efficiency driven by AI or digital technologies, there's a risk of widening income gaps, jobless growth, lots of GDP growth, but less jobs. So we have rights to work, right? So there is economic dimensions there. So I also want to just bring that up. A right to work, right to community, human connections, right? With that, I want to, again, welcome and thank you all. Look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction to this subject. My name is Christoph Lüdke. I'm the director of this Institute for Ethics in AI. And let me say a few words about this institution, which has now been around for 5 years. Almost exactly 5 years ago, we held the opening of this institute. And I see a few familiar faces and many new faces, of course, here. As you see, most of the technology schools and departments of TUM are out here in Garching. And we are working together with them on issues of AI ethics, AI governance. So I said technology and non-technology. And I think this is quite important. We have so far, I think, almost in all our research projects done this kind of tandem approach between the two. And I think it's very important to have, so not just to focus on the philosophical or ethical or legal side, or exclusively on the technological side. And we've held Responsible AI Forum, which is a big conference. It's a series of conferences now. We held the first one in virtual mode in 21, and the second one last year here in person. And as it looks, there will be more conferences of this series. So we hope to engage a lot more on these topics. And let me say a bit more now about the current situation about AI ethics. Because where do we stand right now? And I think it's quite interesting. When we started here in 2019, we have on few occasions already worked together with Globethics, which is a very fruitful partnership. At that time, it was more like you could work on AI ethics in the broad sense. You could have, for example, a master thesis on AI ethics. What is AI ethics? And this has, since then, of course, been much more specialized. So you had AI ethics and governance in specific areas, specific topics. And now we are in particular, and this is why I think it's quite important to connect here to what Wallace has said. We are focusing more on the business dimension in the sense of what is corporations' duties, responsibilities to work on these topics. It was more, some years ago, it was more like technology ethics. What do individual people have to do? What do programmers have to do? What do managers of system administrators have to do? So this has changed quite a lot, and it's now more clear that we have to look at this business ethics angle of AI ethics, and I think this is quite a good way to see it, because ethics and the business side, they have to go together. If you in particular, so in the AI area, if you have AI without ethics, it will not work. People will just not trust those systems, will just not use those systems they do not trust. And so they will not, as a company, you will have to find a user base of your systems. That's why we all this talk about trustworthy AI, responsible AI, and ethical AI, of course. So you will have to convince people that this system is something to trust. And that's why it's so important now to have kind of ethical guidelines or other frameworks like we see now in the EU AI Act, which will be, of course, a huge topic here for this kind of technology. So without much further ado, I would like to open the discussions and the further sections that we have in the breakout sessions. I'm happy to see all of you here in our still relatively new offices in Garching. Hopefully the weather will also get a little better. It might, as it looks, it should be a little better. And I mean, already at this point, I would like to thank the many people who have made this possible. Just to mention Alexander Kriebitz, Caitlin Corrigan, Oksana Bock, Doris Meyer, Raphael Max, and those that, of course, Julia Howard, and of course, also again, thank Globethics for their partnership in this. Thank you very much.
All right, great. So now we're going to move into the panel session to open us up, kind of just get us all moving on this topic, get some opinions out there, and we'll leave some time for questions for this as well. So I'll invite my three panelists up to come sit with me up here. So, oh, let me switch the slide here. Oh, sorry, I forgot to go over the agenda for the day. I think you've all gotten it. We're now at our panel break, our panel discussion. So I'd very much like to welcome our three panelists, Ambassador to the Gambia to Switzerland, Mamadou Ka. I'll introduce you first, is the ambassador to the Republic of Gambia and the Swiss Confederation and the permanent representative to the UN Office at Geneva World Trade Organization and other international organizations at Geneva. He is currently the Vice President for Africa of the Human Rights Council, and he is a founding board member of the International Digital Health and AI Research Collaborative in Geneva, Switzerland. Ambassador Ka, I'd love to hear some opening thoughts from you on our topic of AI and human rights.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to hand you the mic.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, and thank you, Wallace. Thank you, Director, for your very warm welcome and opening remarks, and for hosting such a very timely and important topic that is in the minds of us in Geneva and the multilateral organizations. Hardly you go to a session where the issues of AI and human rights do not come. I think it's a good thing that the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly of the UN are taking the issues of human rights and the centrality of a human rights approach to artificial intelligence. I'm sure you know recently the General Assembly came up with a document, a resolution on AI. The Human Rights Council is yet to come up with a resolution, but the current presidency of the Human Rights Council set up a co-facilitation of new technologies, artificial intelligence, digital divide, and human rights that is co-facilitated by the Gambia, Luxembourg, the ambassador of Luxembourg, and the ambassador of South Korea. And we're working diligently to ensure that there is a human rights approach on the universal governance of data as well as artificial intelligence and how it will evolve into standards. I think the point that the director mentioned, the importance of the actors and agents of this technology to factor very early on the importance of human rights in the deployment of AI tools and services. We all know that artificial intelligence is crucial and is here to stay. The risks are there, but we must not be intimidated by the risks. We must converge collectively together to put the guardrails that are very important to ensure that businesses are more responsible, developers are more responsible, and to have human rights guidance in the approach of deploying this technology. So in my mind, what's new and what is the human rights and governance landscape? The landscape of human rights and governance is an evolving process. It continues to evolve with new developments and challenges. Once you address one, more will come at you. So it's not an end, it's a continuum. Some of the recent threats, of course, there is an increased awareness. There are regulatory efforts that are going on, which are very, very important. Some countries and regions have started to develop these regulatory frameworks and guidelines so that we can address the human rights implications of AI, such as the recent EU AI Act and the proposed AI legislations. The US is coming up with one, China is coming up with another. Another element within the landscape is ethical AI initiatives that are going on. Organizations are focusing on developing ethical standards and principles and frameworks to promote the responsible use and development of AI and in the deployment of AI. Also, intersectionality is very important. The rising focus on understanding the intersectionality of human rights issues. So of course, some of the examples that are trying to address this, which I'm sure we will talk about later, the efforts of the Council of Europe's conversation on AI, the EU AI Act, the United Nations Human Rights Council, as I mentioned, trying to connect AI, new technologies, digital divides, and human rights, and also the Commission for Science, Technology, and Development's efforts on a key element that is often left in the discussion of artificial intelligence and human rights, which is data governance. Data is very, very important, and we cannot talk about human rights of artificial intelligence without engaging on how the governance of data is going to be. Data ownership, data sovereignty, cross-border data, data privacy and security. These are very, very important elements. The data that goes onto these LLMs, these learning models, are also very important. So the Human Rights Council is trying to address this. I will quote the current commissioner, Mr. Volkotyuk, who says that AI must be aligned with the rights and dignity of the individual, and its development should be guided by our shared human values. I think one could not have better put it together by infusing the importance of human dignity as we begin to think about frameworks and conventions around AI. The African Union's digital transformation strategy for Africa also is a proactive effort to address AI's role in the continent's digital future. How is that going to shape? How is it going to be structured? How is it going to be mindful of the unique diversity of context as well as adaptability? The other thoughts that I have is sometimes we overlook the positive impacts of AI on human rights. It is important that it is crucial to address the challenges, but it is equally important for us to recognize the positive impacts that AI can have on the implementation of human rights. AI has the potential to significantly enhance the protection and promotion of human rights in multiple ways. It will require our mindfulness and our convergence on the universal principles and standards to have a governance architecture that can facilitate that. It can also improve access to justice. AI can streamline legal processes and make legal information more accessible to the general public so that it is not skewed. It can drive, you can have AI-powered platforms that can provide legal guidance and advice and assistance, helping individuals understanding their rights and navigate the legal systems. Of course, we have to be very careful with the learning models and the data that is being used. But there are efforts out there that are coming up with more mathematically driven AI models that are not like the generative AI models that we have them that are quite restrictive. So you can have more precision with the approach of mathematically based AI models that use a much more inclusive data. It can also enhance healthcare. These AI technologies can improve healthcare delivery by enabling very early diagnostics and personalized treatments, thus addressing better health outcomes and increase access to medical care, particularly in more and many underserved environments that gets into the right to health. It can promote education, it can facilitate disaster responses. The other thoughts that I wanted to share is some of the challenges and gaps as well as on research. Algorithm bias and discrimination is one of the more pressing issues which can perpetuate and exacerbate existing inequalities. And research is needed. Those of you in this room must make it your business to try to develop methods that can identify and mitigate biases in AI systems. Policies must enhance fairness and non-discrimination in all applications, and it will require researchers to approach it from an evidence base. Data privacy and security. AI systems must rely on very vast amount of personal data that raising very significant privacy and security concerns. We must ensure that data that is collected, that is stored and used in compliance with human rights standards are essentials as well. So the standard bodies in the business sector must incorporate a human rights approach and human-centric approach to standards and data. And researchers are needed to develop robust data protection mechanisms. Transparency and accountability is also very important. There is a lack of clarity of AI decision-making processes, which creates challenges to transparency and accountability. So it is important that businesses and developers of AI systems have explainable and understandable aspects for non-experts. It reminds me in the early days of technology, when we began to advance developing and designing technologies, the issues of human factors and ergonomics and cybernetics and human-computer interaction was resisted by early developers of technologies. And it has evolved to a point where it is part of the requirements engineering guidance of engineering artifacts and design today. Most of these technologies being designed and developed have a human factors element as part of the requirement. So therefore, we ought to be able to come up with mechanisms and guidelines and frameworks that can be used by developers of AI systems, because there are situations where that happened before. Inclusivity and accessibility are also very important. As AI evolves, diversity of voices and perspectives, particularly from the global south, are very important. These are disproportionately affected by this technological advancement. So we must ensure inclusivity and accessibility in AI design and in the implementation and usability of AI to deter the exacerbation of social inequalities. What kinds of action plans need to be taken? In my humble mind, research collaborations are very important. Impact assessments are very important. Universities have a role. Capacity building is very important because most of humanity do not have the competencies and the capacities to be able not only to use, but to adapt to these emerging AI technologies being deployed. Policy developments are very important. We must advocate for the development of comprehensive, adaptive regulatory frameworks that prioritizes human rights and AI governance as well, which focus on transparency, accountability, and fairness. If not, it will create more social problems, more economic problems, and more cultural problems for societies. Also, another action plan, an action activity is on community engagements. Engagements with affected communities, civil society organizations, academic institutions, and human rights advocates must ensure that the perspectives are integrated into policy discussions and decision-making processes. We must also have a mechanism. How do we monitor? And how do we evaluate? How do we establish mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and evaluations of AI systems to developers to assess their compliance with human rights standards and identify areas for improvement? If we don't do this, then it will be a mirage in my mind. We also must think about what will be the shape and form of ethical frameworks and governance. How do we establish ethical frameworks that will guide AI development and deployment as a continuous challenge, that the technology evolves faster than we can keep up? So these frameworks must be agile, must be dynamic, and must reflect evolving technological and societal contexts. International collaborations, the role of multilateral organizations are very crucial to harmonize these frameworks globally. The importance of ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, the importance of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organizations, as well as other actors and agents in multilateral organizations and civil society and academic institutions. So in a short, multi-sectoral approach is very important for us to effectively action this. Lastly, as the topic is looking at the issue of convention, I think that, I don't know how far you have gone with that, but I'm curious on how the Convention on AI and Human Rights is being thought of here in Munich, but it's very, very important. In my mind, it ought to be a very progressive, dynamic convention. It cannot take the shape and form of traditional conventions that has been created before. And again, we must not forget, once we are architecturing or framing this convention, not to ignore the centrality and importance of data in the convention. The convention cannot just talk about AI without addressing the crucial element of data, which is the new contested arena. So, well, are we going to have a data convention as well as an AI convention? Or can we encapsulate in the AI conventions the issues around data so that it is comprehensively and systematically and holistically addressed? So there needs to be a very clear human rights framework. The convention, in my mind, should be firmly grounded in international human rights law that will emphasize the protection of rights such as privacy, such as non-discrimination, such as freedom of expression, and the right to fair trial in the context of AI technologies, striking a balance that will not stifle innovation and creation. It must also be guided by ethical principles that will incorporate ethical principles into the convention that will guide the development, deployment, and use of AI technologies. And the principles should prioritize transparency, accountability, fairness, and respect for human dignity. We can have all the rights that we want, but if it doesn't converge to human dignity, then we have a problem. So the convention can help to put that in place. It must also address the prohibition of bias and discrimination. It should address transparency and accountability, as well as data privacy and security, and a very important element, which is human oversight and control. I hope that this progressive convention that is being debated here or discussed or finalized should emphasize the importance of human oversight in AI decision-making processes, because that's where the challenge is, particularly in critical areas that will affect humanity, such as healthcare, the criminal justice, and autonomous weapons systems. How do we make sure that the security interest doesn't conflict with the need of a human rights approach globally? How does it redress mechanisms? How do we establish redress mechanisms for individuals who have been harmed by AI systems? How do we include procedures for complaints and investigations and compensations for damages? How does the convention addresses issues of international cooperation and collaboration that have global implications of AI and human rights? How do we address and foster sharing of information, transparent sharing of information, and sharing competencies and capacity that will create assistance to member states to promote and harmonize approaches to AI? How is the convention going to address the issues of monitoring and review mechanisms and the civil society engagements? I will stop there and say that these are just some humble thoughts that I wanted to contribute to this discussion, and I look forward to your Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Ka. That was a very nice overview for us to start with. And I think it really exemplifies the multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary, approach that is needed, which is why we have such a diverse group here today in terms of those factors. Picking up on what you said about the importance of research, we're sitting here at the Technical University of Munich, top research institution, particularly looking at AI. And we have here with us today Professor Marcello Ienke, who is at the TUM School of Medicine and Health and is a professor of ethics and of AI for neuroscience. He conducts research on the ethically sustainable development of AI systems and neurotechnologies. He used theoretical and empirical methods to investigate ethical, social, and political implications of these technologies, focusing on topics such as brain-machine interface, the relationship between AI and human cognition, and the ethical processing of big data. And he is the neuroethics lead of the International Brain Initiative and an expert advisor to the UN. So Marcello, maybe you can kind of build off of what Ambassador Ka already said and give us kind of your perspective out of the research.
Very glad and honored to be here. So I want to thank the Institute for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel on such an important, timely topic. So in my input statement, I'll try to be brief. I just want to highlight three main points that I'm happy to expand later in the Q&A. And the first point I want to highlight is that the relationship between artificial intelligence and human rights is a complex relationship. In particular, when we talk about the human rights implications of AI, we implicitly refer to a dual meaning. So there is the meaning of preventing AI-induced violations of human rights, which are something that Ambassador Ka outlined quite extensively. So there is a risk that by misusing artificial intelligence, we can introduce new forms of human rights violations. For example, by using biased systems that can discriminate people algorithmically based on characteristics such as gender, race, political opinion, religious belief, and so on. But there is also another dimension, which I think it's equally, if not more important, which is preserving and promoting human rights through artificial intelligence, because AI can be not just the threat, but also a catalyzer of human rights protection and preservation worldwide. And I'm coming from the field of AI as applied to medicine, and medicine is a perfect example of this. So AI could be a promoter of the right to health internationally, for example. In particular, ubiquitous medical AI could introduce state-of-the-art medical diagnostic systems or assistive systems, and potentially one day also therapeutic systems worldwide without borders and without potentially financial constraints, depending on the AI models that we will develop. So this is very important. Also, Kathleen mentioned that my research focuses primarily on brain-computer interfaces. For those who don't know, these are systems that can establish a direct communication pathway between the brain of a human being and the computing world in a manner that bypasses the neuromuscular system. So people can basically interact with computers using thought alone. And these systems rely extensively on artificial intelligence in order to optimize functioning, classify the necessary features of a person's intentionality in order to translate them into commands that a computer can generate. And this is, again, in my view, an example of a technology that can massively promote and preserve human rights. For example, I'm working with patients who are severely paralyzed, including patients who are in the conditions in which they are no longer capable of communicating, for example, due to the advanced stages of neurodegenerative disorders, such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and giving them the possibility to leverage AI to interact again or to restore a form of interaction with the outside world is a necessary medium for them to exercise some of their fundamental rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, because that's the only channel through which they can express themselves. So this is the first point I wanted to highlight. The second point is that the relationship between AI and human rights is a complex one, also because it's not one directional, it's not one way, but it's bidirectional. It goes both ways. So AI can influence and affect human rights. I tried to just summarize why I think this is the case. So AI definitely has an impact on shaping and modulating our rights, both in potentially in a positive and in a negative sense, as we have seen. But at the same time, human rights can, and I would say here, I would introduce a little bit of normativity here. AI can and should influence and shape AI. So the way we develop and apply human rights can and should influence the future of artificial intelligence. And I was very sympathetic with the introductory statement that human rights are the greatest invention of humankind. I think this greatest invention needs to be leveraged properly to ensure that the technological futures we're going to live in are futures that are desirable. And the last point is that AI is eminently a human rights issue. And this is the reason why I have been working in the last few years quite extensively, both academically and with policy organizations, focusing on one specific subset of human rights, which we have called the neuro rights, which are the rights that are directly related to the brain and mind of a person. Because there's, we have already, with technological advances, we have been exploring new forms of human rights protection. For example, advances in gene editing and genetic sequencing have led to the subfield of genetic rights. For example, the right against genetic discrimination based on genetic features, or the right not to know one's genetic information. Now we have AI systems that can, more than any other technology in the history of mankind, interact with fundamental human capabilities at the cognitive and affective level, so that they can interact with our agency, our personal identity, our sense of self, our consciousness, our language, our memories. And therefore, AI systems of this kind are a fundamentally human rights issue that ought to be addressed also in a very granular sense. So these were my points. I want to conclude with some broader remark regarding the perspective that I think a convention or any type of normative discussion about AI should have. And I think that precisely because AI is inherently a human rights issue that affects basic human entitlements of the human person, its governance must necessarily be a global governance that ensures access and human rights alignment worldwide. And here I agree completely with Ambassador Kha on this. You were quite eloquent on this point. But I think we should remind ourselves that I believe, even though we probably all agree that governance models for AI ought to be global governance models, we are at the point where we are facing very dramatic and radical imbalances in the way AI technology is developed and governed worldwide. So we have dramatic imbalances in the concentration of AI power. This is the most obvious one, but AI is currently affecting all humanity, but it's been developed by a very small number of humans, localized in very specific areas of the globe, especially highly industrialized countries in the global north, especially in the United States. Then we also have dramatic imbalances in information asymmetries between data generators and processors. All humans are generating data willingly or inadvertently, but the data are being processed quite selectively by very few data processors that therefore have a very strong epistemic injustice and informational asymmetry implemented in the process. And then the last, and I think probably most dramatic imbalance regards access to the benefits of AI technology. So we are developing AI systems, but the benefits of these AI systems are not evenly distributed worldwide. So I think any discussion about the ethics of AI should address this in order to mitigate these imbalances. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Some really great insights into kind of the need for this conversation right now. And it leads me to present our last panelist here. Sarah Heckler is a human rights and labor standards expert in the UN Global Compact Network, Germany. Corporate human rights due diligence has been at the core of her work since her dual degree in human rights and international political economy. Building on her prior work with multi-stakeholder initiatives in the automotive and energy industry, she contributes to the local catalog of learning formats and publications of the largest global initiative on corporate sustainability. So bridging again this business and human rights perspective, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the conversation so far.
Yeah, I'll start off with the same things that has already been said, which is thank you for the invitation. We love to come to these kind of spaces to engage with a new group of people on these issues. And if I may, I'd love to start with a quick show of hands, because I feel like we're the least known of the three of us. Who has heard of the UN Global Compact? Okay, I'll shorten the bit. So you've already said we are the biggest worldwide initiative for corporate responsibility and sustainability. We are part of the UN family, very much founded around 2000, and I work for the German network. So I'm not a head office New York kind of person. I very much work with companies on the ground. And more specifically, I work with about 1,300 members that we have in Germany, where you have everything represented from your really, really big kind of DAX companies, but also your small and medium-sized enterprises. But perhaps more importantly, we also have a lot of non-business members, which include civil society, unions, universities. So we very much have a multi-stakeholder perspective. And that is also how we view AI and human rights, which I think is a very, very unique and interesting kind of perspective, because we come from a UN background, which means we work a lot, for example, with our colleagues in Geneva from the BTEC project, great initiative. But I also spend a lot of my work time, talking with companies who are actually working with AI, developing AI, or implementing AI. And I think that oftentimes in especially some academic conversations, we can overlook our target audience, because companies are actually one of the central factors when we talk about AI. They're the ones who are implementing what we're talking about. And at the same time, I feel like a lot of times we don't speak their language when we do talk about their work. So I see our position very much as a mediator between these kind of spaces to explain to people who haven't got the time or opportunity to talk with companies what the issues are on the ground, and at the same time explain to companies what a human rights framework even means. The kind of main part of my input I want to dedicate to what I call the big gap, which is the fact that while we have amazing initiatives for regulation, while we have amazing ethical AI initiatives, we have no global approach. And I think especially in the area of tech, even more than others like global supply chains, you cannot have a localized approach because it's insufficient. AI is a global issue, and even if we were to presume that the EU AI Act was the most progressive, perfect act there was, which it isn't in some aspects, it only covers a certain amount of companies in a certain region, while the issue of AI and human rights very much is a global one. So for me, the big issue is finding a more globalized approach with a shared language that actually works for everybody. And I think that the key starting point for that is to use a platform we already have. So you already mentioned, Ambassador Carr, the recent UN General Assembly resolution, which very much emphasized the role of the UN guiding principles, which are also the basis for all of my work, which I think serve as an excellent kind of starting platform to even have a discussion about what corporate responsibility means in a human rights and AI context. Because another issue we have is that it's very hard to build something from the ground up. While AI is an entirely new issue and very much deserves a unique and evolving perspective, it is hard to set out and create parallel systems to what we already have. So a lot of the companies we tend to work with have human rights due diligence, in part because they have to. I work with German companies. There's this German supply chain law. So they are on an obligation to build these kind of very fundamental systems of analyzing your risks, establishing a complaints mechanism, engaging with stakeholders, communicating your responsibility and also where you went wrong. So what we've been actually advocating for and working with, also in collaboration with our colleagues from TU Munich, who we've written what I think pretty good publication with, is to get companies to understand that you can integrate AI into your existing responsibilities. If you are already conducting a human rights risk analysis where you're looking at, okay, how does my business impact people and human rights? Why not just include AI in that process? Yes, you need to get your engineers on board and explain to them what human rights are, which can be a difficult process. I can tell you that from personal experience, but it's a process that's worth the effort. And I'd kind of like to close with something that both of you have already done, which I'm actually really grateful for, which is also point to the opportunities. Because I think a lot of the times we understandably talk about the risks because they are big. I've brought along a few examples if you want to talk about that later, about where we've gone wrong, because we can talk with companies in an anonymized way where they've gone wrong in the past, and there's some very interesting cases out there. We've specifically I always use two examples, the first of which is that a lot of the companies that do these risk analysis have a supply base of about 70 or 80,000 suppliers. So when they're trying to identify human rights risks, they very much rely on automated tools that often rely on AI to predict where my biggest human rights issues are. So if I'm a company that's looking to be more responsible and work on human rights, the first thing I need to do is prioritize and find out where are my human rights risks. And ironically, they use AI to do that. And the second thing I would like to emphasize is that there are a lot of very good public interest AI projects out there. We recently had somebody on one of our panels who's trying to get IT students to join NGOs where they build human rights databases in order to equip NGOs with better data to actually write better reports on where human rights risks are going to be in the future. And when we talk about a convention on AI and human rights, I think I want to emphasize two issues. The first one is building on accepted and existing standards, because that's the easiest way to get people on board with what you're doing. We are going to have several conventions, several initiatives, and it's going to take a while to kind of get all of them to join around one common format. And the easiest way to do that, in my opinion, is to use something we already have and adapt it to our needs. And the second part is to include all of the voices. You basically already did that by hosting this workshop, trying to get a diverse group of people. But again, as a multi-stakeholder initiative ourselves, I think it's really, really important to not discount any voices and to actually create a platform where everybody can be heard, which isn't as easy as it sounds, because even trying to find out who might be relevant can be a big first step. But that is what I would hope that a new convention kind of tries to do and tries to address.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you all. I think, I mean, it's nice that you all brought it back to the convention at the end too, which is why we're here today. And I like your comments on the need, but also, I mean, it's not easy to bring these stakeholders together, right? I mean, we're doing it on a level here, but even that required, you know, a lot of really purposeful decision making. And I also like, I think you all brought up a lot of the risk, but also immense potentials in terms of AI, of human rights. And the next question was more about kind of the operationalization of all this, right? How do we do, what's the next step? How do we do it? And one of the things I really like, you know, I also say AI is not the first disruptive industry we've ever seen, right? It's not the first policy making challenge we've ever seen. So I think this point of there are things out there, there are mechanisms out there, there are groups already working on things, and how can we capitalize upon those to move the situation forward, I think is a really important point. But what do you still see, any of you, as the major challenge to this? That's one part of the question. The other question is, where have you seen maybe really great examples to look to of where maybe we have brought important stakeholders together successfully, where we have given a voice to the global majority in a way that it didn't have before, or brought in vulnerable groups or other stakeholders? I mean, do you have examples from your work where you've seen that done well, or where you've seen immense challenges you can pick up on?
Well, very important question. From my vantage point, the global platform, convening platform for human rights work is the UN Human Rights Council. That is where you have all member states that converge to debate, to engage on issues that are relevant to adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's the best convening platform, not the easiest, because you have multiple interests, diversity of interests and contexts that are very different. But in my mind, that and the General Assembly, you mentioned the importance that there ought to be a global ownership and a global response. For human rights to be taken seriously, whether it's on the accountability mechanisms or the transparency or the deterrent or hold to account, the only place is in the Human Rights Council, where you have state actors and non-state actors that have a voice. Multilateralism is very important. That's where countries like the Gambia will have a voice with the most powerful countries of the world where AI is skewed. It is just recently that the Human Rights Council, we are working very hard to bring it to the mainstream of the Human Rights Council. About a week ago, we held a side event on the margins of the 56th session of the Human Rights Council, which was convened by the president of the council, myself from the Gambia, the ambassador of Luxembourg, and ambassador of South Korea. And the room was packed. That demonstrate global interest on coming up with a mechanism to mainstream and use a human rights approach. The challenge is on the operationalization. The challenge is how do we galvanize the global community to have a consensus approach on a universal governance of AI. And what does that mean? How are we going to measure that? How are we going to assess that? And we also have to pull the other actors of multilateralism. The International Telecommunication Union is very important. UNESCO is very important. The Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, is very important. Even the dimension on climate, the World Meteorological Organization that spews out a lot of data for environmental issues that affects food security, that affects health. So convergence of platforms where voices can be heard, the neglected voices, the vulnerable voices on the responsible discussion of responsible AI. That's what I would say is very crucial. And also the current Global Digital Compact that actually is going on its third revision. I think the Ref 3 is coming out this week. And there are paragraphs on human rights there. Of course, the first Ref 2 was not strong enough, but we're hopeful that it will be strengthened further. Once it gets to the Global Digital Compact and gets to the summit of the future, then the operationalization, we can all collectively work on it. And I can't overemphasize the importance of academia and civil society organizations in this dialogue. Academia must make it its business to follow what is happening in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, because there are resolutions coming up, there are joint statements coming up. I think it will be interesting from a research point of view to have your researchers dig in to what member states are agreeing to. Because once these agreements are made, then it becomes binding for most of humanity. How is this going to work, not only at the convention level, but at the treaty level? How does international human rights law begin to address these issues? When you get to the WTO, what is the nexus of trade and AI and human rights there? Because now digital trade is a reality. Trade facilitation and trade rules are being augmented.
Yeah. Marcelo, building on that, from a kind of, as I said, the role of research, have you had best practices, good experiences, challenges you've seen in kind of making that bridge, that transition from your work to kind of impacting the policy discussion?
Yes. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I second Ambassador Scott's comment. I also think that the Human Rights Council is the primary platform for this. But I also think that we should be reminded that human rights are high-level principles that ought to be operationalized, and their operationalization kind of forces us to develop a sort of multi-level governance framework, because we need to operate at the level of fundamental rights, but we also need to operate at other levels simultaneously. For example, at the level of mandatory governance, at the nation level, also more specific governance, for example, device regulation, data protection regulation, and so on, as well as the level of self-governance by research actors. And I think here the notion of responsible innovation is key. So mandatory governance is fundamental, but we have also seen positive examples in non-mandatory governance, for example, soft law, ethical guidelines, and this kind of instruments that have been shaping entire fields in the past. So, for example, I come back again at the example of medicine. Self-regulation is also very important, and researchers can play a key role in doing that. And I think the global AI research community can do more in engaging in AI ethics and developing self-regulation instruments, which I need to stress will not replace mandatory governance, but will complement mandatory governance potentially as an effective way as it happened in other fields of scientific research, such as biomedicine. But then I think the research community can also impact the global governance on AI, not just by developing self-regulation mechanisms, but also in establishing a bridge between basic research and AI policy. Because again, in technology governance, we've seen multiple times the emergence of a gap between these communities with either policy instruments that are too detached from the actual research or from the actual business development and technological innovation, or vice versa, the technological innovation and research domain being uninterested in the policy debates. And whenever this gap, this hiatus happens, then there are good chances that we're going to end up either with suboptimal instruments of governance because they're not sufficiently informed by the actual research and by the actual technological development, or with optimal but insufficiently implemented instruments simply because the research community was not engaged. And here I should say that I've seen positive experiences at the level of some intergovernmental organizations that have tried to operate in this field. And I was glad to hear that Ambassador Khan mentioned UNESCO, because UNESCO is very active in creating this translational governance platforms within their mandate of protecting culture, because science and technology are part of human culture, and therefore the protection of human rights in the context of science and technology development, including AI, is part of UNESCO's mandate. And UNESCO has a recommendation on AI, and now is also working on a recommendation on neurotechnology. And I'm part of that process, so I could see from the inside how effective this platform that UNESCO provides is. And I think also the OECD has a very strong record of responsible innovation, with several recommendations on responsible innovation in AI and other contiguous technology. And I think what is interesting about the work that the OECD is doing is that they're really focusing a lot on implementation. They're really focusing an equal amount of time and energy in developing implementation instruments, including innovative implementation instruments such as toolkits that could really allow companies to operationalize the high-level principles of the recommendation into product design standards and technological features that then can align the technology with the governance requirements.
Thank you. I want to give Sarah a chance to also comment and build on that. That I want to pick up on some things that were mentioned about the global approach and how there's really a need for a global approach. But we also heard, different comments about the different sectors are different, or the different communities might have different needs. So how are you rectifying this need for the global approach with the obvious observation we've all had that there are different needs in different sectors or in different parts of the world or with different communities?
Yeah, I think I'll just build on the trend and add more UN organizations to the mix. Because yes, the work OECD, UNESCO do, we love working with them. They're great colleagues. I'd like to throw BTEC into the ring as well. A great initiative by OHCHR, very much focused on generative AI, which is more of a subset. But I think some best practices that we can see there is, first of all, open consultation. So our colleagues from the BTEC project basically have these workshops where they get the biggest companies, as well as unions, as well as civil society, as well as states on around one table, draft the first document, and then throw it into the public and ask anybody who's interested to comment, which is very much what you were emphasizing earlier, Bon, about the whole transparency and monitoring, which I think is a very important process. And then, if I may, I'll share a brief one actually from corporate practice. One of the companies we kind of worked with and consulted prior to and after our publication that we did together was SAP. Big software company, and they actually have an AI ethics council. So this is a council that consists 50% of AI experts within SAP who are very much working with their own systems, and 50% from external experts. So a lot of researchers, but also some civil society actors. And they meet about biannually, and they bring practical cases that they struggled with. So say, for example, they're developing this thing and they come across a kind of case that they think could be a precedent for the future. They collect those, bring those to the council, to the expert council, and put it up for debate. And they make a joint decision on how they want to proceed with that in the future. And that actually informs their internal dealing with AI issues and policy, which I think is a really interesting, great approach for a corporation to take, because they don't have to do that. Right now, they're under no obligation to take this approach. And then, sorry, I forgot your second part. You were asking about, oh yeah, global, and then yeah. I mean, again, I'll take a kind of human rights due diligence approach, because we have something like the UN guiding principles, which very much send out a global standard on how companies should deal with human rights in general. We also have the OECD guidelines, which very much give a generalized global standards on what corporations have to do on human rights. And then that, for me, trickles down into sectoral approaches. Those form the basis for the sectoral approaches, where you use that as a joint standard, but then supplement it with your own sectoral initiatives. Be it, I mean, you have several, again, human rights due diligence approaches in the chemical sector, agricultural sector, where you then identify your needs, but always going back to the global framework. So for me, it's global, then sectoral.
Yeah, follow up quick. Then I'm going to open up for questions.
Just a quick follow-up from hearing what my two colleagues are saying on the operationalization side of things. Within the Human Rights Council, there are already existing mechanisms, and for this to be operationalized and take root at the local level, meaning at the member state level, our co-facilitation is suggesting that the Human Rights Council have a mandate holder, a special procedure holder, and an using the investigative experts to be on data and AI, so that it is pushed down at the member state level. We also went further and are saying that the Human Rights Council should incorporate in the UPR process, the Universal Review process, so that it is part of the self-review process of the member state, and come back to the council and report on some of these issues, on how human rights approach and where it is in every country, that is looking at businesses, looking at government as well. Also, it needs to be operationalized on the cybersecurity infrastructure of the country, because most of the countries are coming up with this national cybersecurity infrastructure, as well as regional cybersecurity infrastructure connecting to global cybersecurity. And they also have certain elements of human rights as well. So you mentioned the importance of the OHCHR. They're doing tremendous work in this area. And currently, the other mechanisms of the Human Rights Council do touch on some elements of human rights and data protection and data rights and social media. And social media is not the same as human rights, is not the same as artificial intelligence. And people tend to confuse these two. So the operationalization is very important. for standard body organization, like the Bureau of Standards of the ITU, it is very, very important that continuous engagement for them to be part of the discussion on the approach as well as the universality of governance of data and AI. And I like what you have said, that universality is not just a blanket jacket for all. It has to be adaptive, and it has to be contextual, and it has to be evolving and progressive.
Great points. All right, we don't have too much time but I want to assure you all we have many coffee breaks today. We have the whole afternoon to keep discussing all these things, but let's open for a few minutes of questions before we go to our coffee break.
I have actually two questions that are two sides of a coin. So the first question tackles something that I think wasn't really talked about at this panel. It is about the power of big tech companies and the power dynamics. I wonder what's your take on human rights and conventions of human rights on dealing with a bigger problem of big tech power dynamics, kind of making it really hard to mitigate for AI-induced risk. I see a lot of understaffed civil society organization, understaffed public authorities that are kind of trying to cope with the AI-induced risk. However, the actual companies that are kind of part of the problem are actually making benefits and not really kind of coping and dealing with the risk they have induced. So I wonder about the power dynamics and the interlinkage of human rights. And the other part of the coin, the second question is more about the power of AI helping us foster human rights. I very much love this kind of positive approach. However, techno-solutionism is real. So focusing on the solution first and then thinking about the problems that might fit in that category is really a struggle. So I wonder, from your perspectives, from your best practice experiences, how can we cope for techno-solutionism in order to make it really work? Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to reverse engineer your questions and start with the second one, because techno-solutionism is a real concern, but we need to clarify what techno-solutionism means. And that's when we adopt technical solution to solve problems that can better be addressed using non-technical solutions. So, for example, in field of research that I'm quite familiar with, sometimes, there's a tendency in some countries to use socially assistive robots for the care of the elderly, even though the current state of the art of robotics in that field is quite suboptimal, and all patients report that they would rather prefer to interact with actual human caregivers. So there we are fixing with the technical solutions that is suboptimal, something that we can better address using non-technical solutions. For example, better welfare mechanisms or funding more our healthcare system in order to have more human caregivers. But techno-solutionism doesn't mean that sometimes the best solution can be a technical solution. So, for example, going back to the neurodegenerative patients that I was mentioning before, no matter what kind of, social dynamics we implement, which are also very important, but they do need a technological channel to connect their brains to the outside world because the body is failing them. And so techno-solutionism needs to be differentiated from scenarios where actually AI could be a very viable solution, of course, in contingency with other solutions. So my greatest fear is not really solutionism, but reductionism, thinking that we can rely on AI alone without embedding AI in the context of social dynamics, of welfare systems, and human delivered care in medicine. On your first question, that's $1 million question. So we all highlighted, I guess, in this panel that we are in a situation of very strong power imbalances, and tech companies often have greater decisional power than entire countries. Actually, most countries in the world are outnumbered in terms and also outweighed in terms of power. And not just economic power, but also decision-making power and power to influence social processes worldwide. This, I think, is more a political issue than a rights-based issue, but rights and politics, go hand in hand. So I think governments will have to develop systems to address this imbalance, but they will always lag behind because of the structural under the determination. So I think that's why really trying to also exercise soft power to shift the dynamics within tech companies is very important, because if you look at how companies engage. So, for example, I was involved in the OECD recommendation of responsible innovation. Of course, this tendency tends to decrease the bigger the company becomes, because then the stakes become too high. But I think we really need to try to root these processes in this genuine tendency that a lot of companies have, because, as Professor Lütke said in his introductory remarks, AI that is not aligned with ethics and human rights simply will not work. At some point, it will create a backfire effect that will damage the companies themselves. Sorry.
Is it okay if I jump in? I just want to jump on the last question regarding big tech, because I feel like that's kind of the job, at least my American colleagues struggle with a lot. And to a certain degree, if I may, I'd like to actually disagree with you a little bit, because I work with a lot of genuine companies. We have companies who've been engaging on human rights for 20 years with no public pressure whatsoever. But the big impact, the big companies, the big kind of sector-wide impact is not something you're going to get just out of, say your family-based companies who have a genuine interest in acting on this. Regulation is one issue, but we've already talked about the gaps. So my two approaches to that is first of all, business case. I work a lot with a business case, meaning that you need to frame this issue in a way that these companies understand. Mr. Lütke actually did it in his open statement, saying that as a company, there's a real business case for you to develop your AI ethically, because you want your users to actually rely on it. You want them to use it. So for me, you need to make a clear business case why ethical AI is worth the invest. And the second part is public accountability. Take Google. When they first developed their Face ID, for some unknown reason, they had a huge issue with the Face ID actually recognizing people other than their white engineers. So they hired this agency to set out and broaden their database, get more diverse faces, and they didn't do their due diligence. So the agency set out to Atlanta and started photographing homeless people, who were overwhelmingly, of course, not white. And I think it's very fair to say, looking back, if you'll excuse my language, they got a shitstorm about that. They had a huge issue rolling out their Face ID. They had to delay it by 3 weeks. They had to get additional data. So on the one hand, you have the business case factor and responsibility. On the other hand, even if you have a lack of regulation or a lack of genuine interest, you have public accountability.
Thank you so much. I think you raised two very important questions. On the techno solution, I think what will be important is not, what will be a challenge is not incorporating human oversight of the techno solution. I think as long as you have human oversight of it and it has some utility, then it becomes valuable and impactful. Also on that technology itself, does it factor unique cultural and contextual situation for the use of that technology? For example, if it is used within, let's say, healthcare delivery to the elderly, where human touch is very important, where interaction with human help on cognitive function of the patient. So that human oversight is very important, but I agree with your observation on that. On the very first question, as I hear you talk, I tend to agree with you as well, in the sense that businesses have been here before. If you think of the corporate and social responsibility movement of businesses and how that has evolved, how it was a challenge in the beginning and now mainstream throughout businesses, gives you some ray of hope. The other aspect is ESG. ESG now has taken root in businesses and is factored and a key important, because the business case is made that it is good business to be mindful of ESG. And it has even get into the accounting and the bottom line of corporations. So how do we resolve this issue? The two questions. I think change in mindset is very important. I think awareness is very important. I think meaningful collaboration and partnerships with this big tech are very important. I think it is important also for governments to rethink regulatory and legislative frameworks. But the more society is aware, the more knowledgeable actors within society, the more knowledgeable policymakers are, they will be able to get into the transparency, monitoring, and accountability. I also think the role of education is very important. The role of university, the role of curriculum and program structure have to evolve and have to be augmented to fit for purpose for the requirements and needs of the 21st century and AI. Most of our university curriculums are behind. Who are these developers of this technology and deployed this technology? We train them in the university. We teach them how to write code. We teach them how to do algorithms. We infuse values in them. A 3-credit hour or 1 credit hour of ethics wouldn't do it. So we must figure out how do we shape future minds of developers of these learning models to ensure that while they're writing these algorithms and developing them, their mindsets are adaptive to the challenges and the need for human rights approach. When I taught software engineering courses, in the requirements gathering, I always had to factor human factors elements into it. When I teach students to design human-computer interfaces, usability is very important. In my graduate school days, I spent a long time at AT&T Bell Labs testing systems as a usability fellow for usability engineering, where you're sitting with developers and designers of this technology to incorporate human factors. That means that we have to understand the cognitive makeup and how these technologies have to coexist with society and humanity. And I think there is a central role of universities to respond. Institutes like yours, Professor, I think have a role to play on policy to bring capacity and competency training to policy developers of our countries. Because without the expertise and experience on ethics, on AI, how are they going to shape policy? How are they going to shape legislation? Can we prepare modules that are continuous to train future policymakers in the public space? And I think you're opportune to do that. I think I had a conversation with Wallace about this issue, that some of us, even within the Human Rights Council, you have ambassadors that are discussing these issues and are hardly knowledgeable about these technologies. You have lawyers who are talking about human rights, but they are not talking to the developers of these technologies. I think changing that dynamics can address some of the aspects of the questions that you make. I think education is very important. Pedagogy is very important. Mindset is very important. Equipping policymakers who are going to shape legislations and policy and engaging with these companies are very important. And we can learn a lot from what happened on the ESG. Can we create something like the ESG from a human rights angle?
Thank you. I'm going to let Marcelo give one more comment, and I promise you can all go get some coffee.
No, just as a follow-up to this, because listening your comments, I agree 100% with both of you in your prima facie disagreement with me. So either I disagree with myself or I didn't deliver my message clearly, and I guess that's the latter. So I didn't want to transmit a form of naive optimism in the good intentions and goodwill of big tech companies. Of course, some of them do have good intentions, some others do not. But I think the time frame is also very important here, because there is a well-known phenomenon in technology assessment, which is called the Collingridge dilemma, that shows that our ability to predict the impacts of a technology and therefore our capability to influence its development, including through regulation, is inversely proportional to the stage of development of the technology. So the more the technology is entrenched in our society, the easier it is to predict its impact, but the harder it is to regulate it because it's too entrenched. And I think social media is a perfect example of that. You know, there are platforms with several billions of users, and it's very hard for regulators to intervene now. So I think we also need, in order to address your question, to work on the right timescale. So I think with generative AI, in particular, foundation models, now we are still in a stage where we can intervene a lot if we shift from a reactive to a proactive approach. Because for most of recent history in dealing with digital technology, ethics and regulation have been operating very reactively. So, you know, first we waited for Cambridge Analytica to happen before we decided to try to intervene at the regulatory level on social media platforms, but then it was inevitably too late. I think, you know, we need to also shift this paradigm in order to make sure that our next attempts at tackling big tech companies and the imbalances and distortions that they can introduce in markets and in society are addressed early, because earlier then we have more power to intervene with regulatory instruments. When that is too late, then I'm afraid that, you know, our best option is really to try to operate at the level of soft law and persuasive mechanisms as well, you know, as education. And here I agree with you 100%, because, you know, it's always a dynamic, and educated people are less subordinated epistemically in this dynamic.
Thank you so much. Oh, what? We're gonna give it to him. All right.
Very quick second. I think one important element that we didn't get a chance to delve into or dive into is the issues around LLMs and generative AI. LLMs have huge challenges of human rights. And I'm not sure the current mechanisms of LLMs that's the base of generative AI can help us to address the human rights issues. I think researchers have a big, wide field to look into these LLMs and think about what other forms of LLMs can we do to mitigate against the risks of biases in algorithms and the data space that is used, using Bayesian as opposed to a much more wider integrative that is mathematically based and more probabilistic. Right,
Thank you so much. Sarah, do you have any closings? You didn't get a last round?
No, it's fine.
Good, you're good.
I want to help you with your timekeeping.
Yeah, I mean, the point of structuring this around a whole day and mixing with these kind of informal sessions, now we can all go chat and then move back into the groups, is to get both these dynamics, right? So this is exactly why we've set aside a whole day to focus, which is probably not even enough. And like almost all of our IEI events, we have way too much to talk about for the time that has been set aside. And for our couple online viewers, we hopefully will get to your questions in the breakout groups. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time for them here. But I invite you all to take the next 20 minutes to get some coffee, continue the conversations, and we'll come back and hear from Alex about the convention in detail. Yeah, thank you all.